Chapter 2: Narratives that Derail Action. The mind has a tendency to explain before it has finished observing. An event occurs, a delay, an interruption, a misstep, and almost immediately a story forms around it. The story does not wait for evidence. It does not ask permission. It arrives with confidence, filling the silence left by uncertainty. And because it arrives quickly, it feels true. These stories are not dramatic inventions. They are ordinary interpretations, shaped by habit and repetition. A pause becomes a signal. A small error becomes a pattern. A moment of hesitation is interpreted as a lack of readiness. None of these interpretations are announced as guesses. They present themselves as conclusions. Once a narrative appears, the body responds as though the conclusion has already been tested. Muscles tense. Attention narrows. The work in front of you is no longer neutral. It is now framed by implication. What should have been a simple next step becomes charged with meaning that did not originate in the task itself. This is how friction enters, not through the event, but through the explanation attached to it. The mind prefers coherence over accuracy. Faced with ambiguity, it reaches for story because story provides shape. Even a pessimistic explanation feels better than none at all. It offers orientation. It tells the mind where it stands. But the comfort of explanation comes with a hidden cost. Once a story is in place, action begins responding to the story instead of the situation. Work slows not because the task is unclear, but because attention is split between the task and the meaning now layered over it. The mind begins to manage implication rather than requirement. It tries to protect against imagined outcomes instead of engaging with what is actually present. These narratives rarely sound unreasonable. They are composed of sensible language. They speak in the voice of responsibility. They suggest caution, preparation, timing. They frame delay as thoughtfulness and hesitation as prudence. Because they sound intelligent, they are trusted. Over time, the same explanations return again and again. They begin to feel familiar. Familiarity hardens them. What began as interpretation gradually becomes identity. The mind stops saying, "This feels difficult today," and starts saying, "This is how I am." At that point, the story is no longer about the work, it is about the self. When identity becomes involved, effort changes shape. The task becomes symbolic. Progress feels like validation. Difficulty feels like exposure. Under these conditions, action carries emotional risk far beyond its practical stakes. The mind becomes protective. It looks for ways to soften engagement or postpone it altogether. The irony is that these narratives often claim to be keeping you safe. They warn against failure, embarrassment, wasted effort. But in practice, they protect the story more than the person. They preserve a sense of coherence at the expense of movement. They maintain internal consistency by preventing the kind of action that would introduce new information. Meanwhile, the present moment continues without negotiation. The friction created by narrative is not loud. It feels like hesitation. It feels like reconsideration. It feels like the need for just a little more clarity before beginning. But clarity rarely arrives through thought alone. It arrives through contact. When contact is delayed, clarity remains theoretical. This delay has a compounding effect. Each moment of hesitation strengthens the story that justified it. Each avoided action becomes evidence that the narrative was correct. The mind learns from its own retreat, reinforcing patterns it believes it is merely observing. What makes this cycle difficult to interrupt is that it rarely feels like avoidance from the inside. It feels like care. It feels like intelligence being applied cautiously. The mind does not announce that it is afraid to act. It announces that acting would be premature. And so, the day fills with thinking rather than doing. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from this state. It is not the fatigue of sustained effort, but the fatigue of mental congestion. Attention is spent rehearsing, explaining, predicting. Energy drains without producing anything concrete. By the end of the day, the worker feels depleted and vaguely dissatisfied, unable to point to anything proportionate to the effort expended. This exhaustion feeds the narrative further. The mind interprets tiredness as proof of difficulty. The story tightens. The next attempt feels heavier before it begins. All of this occurs without any dramatic failure. No single moment announces that things have gone wrong. The derailment is quiet. Action slowly loses its immediacy. The present moment becomes a place of interpretation rather than engagement. What is rarely noticed is how different action feels when it is stripped of story. When attention rests on what is required rather than on what the requirement might imply, effort becomes surprisingly contained. A task begins and ends. It does not sprawl into identity or future consequence. It responds to energy placed directly into it. Narrative, by contrast, has no natural endpoint. It expands as long as attention feeds it. It demands resolution that only action can provide, yet it often prevents the action that would resolve it. This tension between story and movement sits at the center of most hesitation. The mind wants certainty before acting. Action produces certainty only after it occurs. Until this paradox is understood, effort will continue to stall under the weight of its own explanations. The work itself is rarely what stands in the way. It is the meaning assigned to it, spoken quietly and repeatedly until it feels inseparable from reality. As narratives tighten their grip, they begin to alter not just what a person does, but how they wait. Waiting becomes active. It fills with analysis, rehearsal, self-monitoring. The mind positions itself as responsible, even diligent, while movement quietly recedes. This is how inaction learns to masquerade as preparation. The longer a narrative remains unchallenged by experience, the more convincing it becomes. It gains detail. It acquires examples. The mind recalls past moments selectively, assembling a history that appears to support the story already in place. What began as interpretation hardens into explanation, and explanation hardens into expectation. At that point, effort is no longer delayed by uncertainty, it is delayed by belief. Belief is heavier than doubt. Doubt can coexist with action. Belief, once settled, resists it. When the mind believes it understands why something will be difficult, unnecessary, or poorly timed, action feels redundant. The story has already answered the question. Engagement seems wasteful. Why test what is already known? This is how narratives become particularly efficient at preserving themselves. They remove the incentive to act. Action threatens the coherence of the story, and coherence is what the mind values most. A consistent explanation feels safer than an uncertain outcome. Under these conditions, readiness becomes the mind's preferred currency. The worker begins measuring internal alignment rather than external requirement. They check how they feel before they begin. They assess motivation, clarity, confidence, energy. If these conditions are not present, the narrative supplies a reason to wait. It frames delay as wisdom. It frames restraint as self-awareness. The problem is not that readiness matters, it is that readiness becomes a prerequisite. Once action is conditioned on feeling aligned, emotion gains leverage. Mood begins to determine timing. Inner alignment becomes something to achieve before engagement, rather than something that emerges through engagement. The present moment becomes a threshold to cross instead of a place to work. This shift changes the role of emotion entirely. Feelings are no longer experiences that accompany action. They become signals that permit or prohibit it. A sense of resistance becomes a warning. A lack of enthusiasm becomes a veto. Fatigue becomes a verdict rather than a condition. The narrative supports this arrangement effortlessly. It frames emotional hesitation as intuition. It speaks in the language of self-respect. It warns against forcing things. And because it sounds compassionate, it rarely meets resistance. Yet something subtle is lost in this arrangement. Agency weakens. When action depends on feeling aligned, the mind becomes reactive to its own internal state. It waits for permission from sensations that were never meant to govern behavior. Effort becomes contingent. Consistency erodes. Progress becomes irregular, not because the work is unpredictable, but because the criteria for engagement keep changing. Over time, this produces a strange contradiction. The person believes they are listening closely to themselves, yet they feel increasingly disconnected from their own capacity. Trust shifts away from action and towards mood. Confidence becomes fragile, dependent on internal conditions remaining favorable. This fragility is not emotional sensitivity, it is emotional dependence. Narratives thrive in this dependence. They interpret every fluctuation as information. A low-energy morning becomes evidence of misalignment. A moment of doubt becomes a sign to reconsider direction. The mind remains busy interpreting itself, while the world waits. What is rarely acknowledged is how much readiness is created by movement rather than preceding it. Clarity often follows engagement. Confidence often trails effort. Motivation frequently appears after momentum has already begun. When action is postponed until these states arrive unprompted, they often never do. The narrative, of course, has an answer for this. It insists that forcing action would be dishonest, that working without alignment would produce inferior results, that waiting is a form of respect for the process. These explanations sound refined. They sound thoughtful. They conceal the cost of delay behind the language of care. The cost is not merely lost time, it is lost continuity. Each time action is deferred, the mind reinforces the idea that it cannot proceed without the right feeling. Each delay trains hesitation. Each exception becomes precedent. Eventually, the worker forgets how to begin without internal consensus. Action feels unfamiliar. Starting feels heavy. The simplest tasks carry disproportionate psychological weight. The narrative does not announce this shift. It feels gradual, even reasonable. But the result is a subtle withdrawal from direct engagement with the present. Life becomes something to prepare for rather than participate in. Effort waits for approval that never fully arrives. This is where the climate of the mind and narrative begin to merge. Emotional states supply raw sensation. Narratives interpret them. Together, they create an internal environment that feels authoritative. The present moment becomes filtered through this environment before it is ever met. The worker is no longer responding to what is required. They are responding to what they feel about what is required. At this point, the belief in readiness feels indispensable. Acting without alignment feels reckless. Moving without certainty feels irresponsible. And yet, something in this arrangement quietly contradicts experience. The moments of greatest momentum in life rarely began with perfect clarity. They began with movement that produced clarity along the way. The idea that one must feel ready before acting becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile with how progress actually unfolds. Still, the belief persists because it offers protection. It protects the narrative. It protects the self from exposure. It delays contact with uncertainty. The next chapter turns directly toward this belief, not to dismiss it, but to examine what it costs. It explores how readiness became seductive, why emotional alignment feels necessary, and what happens when action is allowed to proceed without waiting for the mind to feel prepared. Because at some point, effort must stop asking permission from feeling and begin answering the demands of the moment itself.